Good afternoon, everyone. We're going to get started here. I'd like to welcome you on behalf of the David M. Kennedy Center for International Studies, as well as the Social Work Department. We're co-sponsoring this lecture. My name's Dave Schuler. I work here in the building. We're really happy to see such a good crowd come out. Professor Maistry walked in and she said, "I thought you told me there was going to be like 5 or 10 people here." I told her that her fame had spread abroad. And so we'd like to start out this afternoon with opening prayer. And I've asked David Kay to offer that, who's a South Africa facilitator here in the Kennedy Center.
Dear Heavenly Father, thank you for this day, for the opportunity that we have to meet and to learn from Professor Maistry. We ask that Thy Spirit will be with us, that we can learn and grow, and that we can be a little more knowledgeable and wiser about the people who live on this planet with us, our brothers and sisters. And thank you for the many blessings Thou hast given us, and we ask and say these things in the name of Jesus Christ. Amen.
Thank you, Dave. I would like to say right off how grateful I am that Professor Maistry has come such a long distance. She had some 30 hours in the air and lost luggage and a few hours of sleep since she's been here, and she's been raced around various places. I also would like to thank Dr. Jeannie Roby from Social Work, who really has carried the main burden and responsibility of making sure that arrangements are made, and we're very grateful for her efforts. I knew of the reputation of Dr. Maistry over a year ago, but just had the pleasure yesterday of actually meeting her. And I had actually intended on reading this very long bio, but I think just from meeting her and knowing her in these few hours that we spent together, that probably she would just as soon I didn't do all of that. She is a very common sense, down-to-earth person who has obviously spent many years thinking about the difficult issues relating to development and poverty. She is a professor at the Fort Hare University there in East London, South Africa. She works in social work and community development, and these are terms that I think that are familiar to many of us, but they take particular significance in South Africa. She may share some of those thoughts with us. We often talk of the issues of international development and here at BYU, and she has spent her lifetime being concerned with these. Her research interests have included development welfare, identity, culture, feminism, gender studies, spirituality, human values, development of indigenous knowledge, participatory and action research, and learning methods. And we're very, very grateful that she's here, and I will leave it up to her to share any other kinds of information that she would choose to about herself. With that, let's give a welcome to Professor Maistry.
Thank you very much, and a warm good afternoon to everybody. It was hot yesterday, but it's just warm today. I was informed that it was going to be very, very cold, so I have a bag full of thermal wear. And so actually finding something suitable to wear this morning was problematic. I am surprised that there's so many of you here this afternoon. David did say that it was going to be about 10 or 15 people. It's Friday afternoon, and you won't get such a huge crowd, so this is quite surprising. I just want to tell you that when I went to Johannesburg to apply for my visa, there's a process. The American consulate is very strict about visa application. You have to go, since the 1st of September, they changed the rules. You have to fly to Johannesburg, apply for your visa, fill in a DHL envelope, and then wait at home. And after about 4 or 7 days, they'll let you know whether you have obtained the visa or not. But I was leaving on the 13th. My appointment with him was on the 12th. And I said, please, you have to give me my visa because I've already made all my travel arrangements. So I followed the whatever I had to do. You hand in your forms, you wait in the queue, they call your number, you go again, they check your forms, and they interview you. So there was this young American who was interviewing me. And, okay, so who are you? What are you doing? Where do you teach? Fort Hare University. Is that a Mormon university? And I said, no, it isn't. You're going to BYU. That's a Mormon university. And I said, yes. So what are you going to do at BYU? So I show him the program, and why are you going to BYU? So I explained to him, why am I going to BYU? And then he looks at me and he says, don't say anything radical when you go there. So and I thought to myself, no, I'm not going to say anything radical, but what I'm going to talk about is the radical changes that's happening in South Africa at the moment. So I said, I'm quite safe. So he said, yeah, but please don't say anything radical. So what I'm going to talk to you about today, I'm not big on following what I actually prepare. I have a paper that I've written. It's a paper that my colleague and I actually started discussing, and I wrote this out at the beginning of this year. There's a lot of concern about education in the social service professions itself. Social work was the center of social service provision in South Africa for a long, long time. With the changes with the democratic elections, the changes to social welfare, as I said yesterday, the change has been towards a developmental approach. And we're challenged to try to work out conceptually what does development mean for the South African democratic context and a context of transformation. Transformation is not easy. So as far as I always call this the struggle. We've had our liberation struggle, but the struggle is actually now in South Africa, 10 years after political freedom. It's us constructing our knowledge, understanding it in the South African context, applying it, and specifically in the field of social service professions. So social work itself is not at the center of the stage of social welfare anymore. We've got other service professions like child and youth care. Community development has recently been actually thrust to the fore as a very important social service profession in South Africa. But community development, education has not followed this. And there's a need now to look at what does social and community development education mean? My research is looking at development of a 4-year program in social and community development. But what is happening is that instead of looking at both as having a relationship with each other, complementing each other, there's a dichotomy that's being developed between social work on the one hand and community development on the other, as though individuals and families do not belong to a community. So academically, there's quite a discourse going on between social work education and where does community development actually fit into that, and community development education and its relationship with social work. And we've been talking about this in our department. I'll just give you a little bit of background as to the University of Fort Hare. The University of Fort Hare had its main campus in Alice, in the Eastern Cape province, which is one of the poorest provinces in the country. With the emerging of universities, last year we had, from 36 universities, we have 21. As a cost-cutting and towards equity, the National Department of Education decided to merge universities. So right now we have 21 universities. So what was formerly the East London campus of Rhodes University has become part of Fort Hare University. So Fort Hare University currently has a campus in Alice, it has a campus in East London, and it has a campus in Vishu. Now, just the merging of the universities itself has created problems because Rhodes University, and I was employed by Rhodes University, we have a Department of Social Development, which educates students in social work, but there's emphasis on community development also. We have a postgraduate program, a master's program in community development. While the Alice campus educates students in social work, and there's very little emphasis on social development and community development. So as a university itself that has merged with another campus, we're struggling to work out what does the social work education and community development education, what is it and how do we make this work? So this is where my interest has arisen and this is what my research focuses on. But yesterday, Dr. Roby asked an interesting question, and she wanted to know if this would be answered in the course of my talk today, is what do we understand by development? How do we see development in the South African context? And what do we understand by community development? Now, that's very interesting because development studies itself, the Alice campus has a Center for Development Studies. And in my postgraduate program in community development, there's a paper that's called Development and Poverty. So there's two coursework papers. One's Development and Poverty, and the other is Community Management and Leadership. And one of the things we do look at is how do we conceptualize development? And to conceptualize development currently in the South African context, we have to have some kind of international understanding of what development is. So we follow what development, the theories of development. And does every American know the theories of development? Because it originated here after the Second World War. We look at modernization theory, and then that's followed by dependency theory. So those macroeconomic theories are something that our students look at in the postgraduate program. But that still doesn't fully give us an understanding of what is development in South Africa. A lot of emphasis, though, is placed on the humanist paradigm of development. One of the things that my colleagues on the Alice campus do is focus on the political economy of Africa from a developmental perspective. And that's a Marxist perspective of development. And a lot of emphasis is placed on understanding how colonization actually impacted on development in Africa, and then in South Africa, colonization and apartheid. So that is a starting point for understanding development in the Center for Development Studies. I do a more rounded look at development with my students on the East London campus. But very recently, the emphasis has been on the humanist paradigm and looking at the basic needs approach to development, and also Amartya Sen's development as freedom. And I think that's quite important and relevant to South Africa. But we have an organization in Cape Town which is called the Community Development Resource Association. And very interestingly, they've developed a concept of development that I actually find quite agreeable for the South African context, and maybe it's applicable to every context. They talk about development as being an organic process. It is inherent in every human being, in every organization, and in every community. It is a process. So development is seen as a process. And the development practitioner actually intervenes in this development process. Okay. And what the education of a development practitioner should focus on is an awareness of the development process. So if you are looking at individuals, and this is relevant for social work, And if you're looking at working with an individual and assisting an individual, then you have to understand the whole human development and where in this process of human development of this individual, you are actually intervening. The same applies to an organization. So knowing about organizational life and where in this process you are intervening. But for me, the interest is in communities. So in terms of community development, understanding the background, the history of the community, and where the development practitioner is actually intervening in the life of this community. And I think for the South African context, that's quite relevant. So from the humanist paradigm itself, I would think that the program that we are looking at in terms of community development would align itself to the way Amartya Sen looks at development, and also with how we see development as an organic process. So the South African government has adopted what I said yesterday was a developmental approach to social welfare in South Africa. And social welfare, I'd like us to think about it in a broader perspective, not just the system of social welfare, but the social well-being of all the communities, individuals in South Africa. But it makes it very clear, the White Paper for Social Welfare talks about social welfare of the majority in South Africa, those who were previously disenfranchised in South Africa, and development focusing on making them active citizens in the country. So active citizenship is an important focus of development. Okay. So the policy framework, social development provides the policy framework for social welfare in South Africa. Community development is seen as an intervention strategy to combat poverty in South Africa. So the government is emphasizing community development as the intervention strategy for the eradication of poverty in South Africa. The next step is now, what do we understand by community development? We try to do this. One really important aspect of understanding all of these concepts, and I think conceptualization for a specific context is crucial. All of these concepts existed during the apartheid regime. It's important to critique it, to look at where we are now in South Africa, and develop these concepts in relation to the context, the current context of democracy and of transformation. So having a finite definition isn't a reality in South Africa. It's a process. And we do this, I actually do this with every class, is how do we define these concepts in the current context of South Africa? And some of the characteristics that come up is community development is seen as collective action. Okay. It is about people defining their own development. And I think a lot of emphasis, given our history, where even your race was imposed on you, imposition is something that people in South Africa are very, very wary of. It's coming from the outside and imposing what your development should be and how your development should be done. So the collective action plus people defining what their development is all about and participating, planning, and proposing their own development is actually quite crucial. So the building blocks of development, the 4 principles of development currently is participation, is empowerment, is social learning or conscientization. I'm not sure how aware you are of Paulo Freire's teaching of conscientization. It was a process during apartheid. It formed a big part of the whole liberation struggle. So that's something that is still considered as a building block of development and sustainability. But what the government emphasizes, though, is people-centered development. And most of the scholars in South Africa talk about development is about people. It's not about infrastructure. It's not about economics. It's not about GDP or GNP. It's about people. and people should participate in their development. I just want to read you a few sentences about development as people and what is the thinking behind people-centered development. The word for people-centered development in South Africa is Batho Pele. Okay, it's B-A-T-H-O-P-E-L-E. Okay. It's a government policy. Batho Pele is a government policy. It's people-centered development. People should be at the center of their development. And a very significant value in community development is Ubuntu. Okay? It's U-B-U-N-T-U, which emphasizes collective action. Ubuntu actually means that we are who we are through others. Okay? We are human through others. So Ubuntu actually means we are who we are through others. A little different from I think, therefore I am. Okay, so there's this here, this collective action and being human and being involved and being an intricate part of a community is very important. So that actually defines community development. Let me just find this, please. About people-centered development. This is by a South African author who's been writing about development for some time. And this is what he says. Development is about people, and the development effort should be meaningful to them. Okay, it also acknowledges that development is a universal issue. Okay, it's not specific or particular to third world countries alone, because there's issues such as urbanization, pollution, environmental degradation, HIV/AIDS. All of these practices are relevant to most societies. The fact that development is about people, can I bring this down a little bit? It's okay. Yeah, no, that's fine. Development is about people, and it binds us to accept that development involves millions of people who live in poverty and who experience inequality as far as access to economic, political, and symbolic power is concerned. These people must be made the focus of development, action, and intervention. The focus should not be on macroeconomic statistics, such as an increase in per capita income, which often conceals the humaneness, the need and distress of these millions of people. Development must begin by identifying human needs. Development is about people, moves the emphasis from macro-level quantitative approaches to qualitative micro-level approaches. And this involves community values and needs, local customs, knowing local customs, community participation, and indigenous people's knowledge. And I think that's very, very important. This shift in emphasis implies that development is not only about creating infrastructure for the poor, but that it is also about people, their needs, values, and customs, and their understanding of their circumstances. Now, development is about people is to acknowledge that development is about human relationships. The CDRA, this organization that I was talking to you about, the Community Development Resource Association, focuses mainly on development as about human relationships. Human relationships are one of the main determinants of human development. A great deal of the world's misdevelopment is the result of unfair or dysfunctional relationships at international, national, or community level. At national and community levels, power relations, gender relations, ethnic and race relations play a part in shaping or distorting authentic development. And we're very aware of this in South Africa. To argue that development is about people is to acknowledge that development is cloaked in uncertainty. There is very little certainty in development. It's the uncertainty of changing circumstances, changing needs, and eventually changing people. We're working with, in the Eastern Cape Province, I am working with the Department of Social Development, the provincial, or what you call the state Department of Social Development. And change is something that we have learned to accept that happens every day. So if we put a system of structure together today, we know that in about 2 weeks' time, there's going to be changes happening to that. So change is an important element of development. It also implies that people confronted with the message of development have the right to decide on it themselves, what it means to them and whether they want it or not. You cannot force development. No matter how much you think that people actually need development, it cannot be forced if we believe in development is about people. And this is a radical approach in the sense that it grants people the right to reject any development proposal, program, or project if they perceive it as meaningless within the context of their changing reality. There is no blueprint for development. Okay. Development about people implies, now this is something that most African scholars are critiquing, that development is about people, implies a rejection of the assumption that civilization is synonymous with westernization. And that's what the whole modernization theory actually talked about, is third world countries had to modernize to become civilized. And I think that's a very sensitive issue in the African continent currently. We need to acknowledge diversity and support the idea that there is room for all people around this thing called development, irrespective of how it may be defined by those who should benefit from it. So in terms of the discourse itself, this is what is currently happening in South Africa when it comes to people-centered development. Now, I want to take you to how we looked at education for community development and this relationship between social work and community development. I think I'll stop here for a few minutes if there are any questions. Yes.
It seems you talked a lot about the approach that we should take to development. And you mentioned that there should be a human aspect to it. It should be people-centered. But my question is, then what is development? So if development is not modernization, what is it? If we approach it from a human perspective or with a people-centered approach, that's how we're approaching it. But my question is, what is development?
Okay, the way I want to answer this is that when we do work with our students and when we do work with communities, I think it's very important to start from, all of us have an idea of what development is. And it's actually quite dangerous to take that idea into a community and start with development from your own idea. I explain development as a process, and I explain that when you go into a community, you actually intervene into this development process. And it's very important that you become astute and insightful as to where you are intervening. And I think that's quite important. Don't go with the assumption that because you understand development in this way, and that is the way that the community understands what development is. My research, I'm actually talking to communities now, asking them what is their understanding of development. I think I'm doing this because we develop curriculums at tertiary institutions without actually talking to the main participants of development, and that is the communities. Okay, and I think we need to get an understanding of how do they see development, what is their understanding of it for them. So from my research, I would like to work through with communities and their understanding of development. I have all this theoretical understanding of development. I could take this and say, look, development is modernization. This is what you have to do. Development is looking from a basic needs approach. It could be a combination of all of them, and the communities would be able to tell you that.
I think along with that, are you familiar with the South African Homeless People's Federation?
Yes.
Does this work? Yeah. With their federation and their own meaning of development and what they've been able to do, it's influenced my own views of development and how to work within my own my own society. And so I think also we need to keep in mind that people doing things on the ground are actually our source of information, where we learn from them how to incorporate better educational methodologies and things that we're mutually learning from one another, and that there is no right meaning or definition of development.
I think it's very important to remember that as long as you're not causing any harm, and then you're working with people in certain ways, that you have certain principles and values as a development practitioner, I think that's very important.
I was just wondering if you could give some examples of actual programs that have been implemented, maybe, or even some of the views of the people from the community, what their thoughts were of development.
Some of the programs that the Department Community Development Work is actually working with, we talked about this yesterday, is that the emphasis is on poverty alleviation. That's what the government is talking about, poverty alleviation. So it's going to what in the Eastern Cape Province, and this is not happening all over South Africa. The Eastern Cape Province is actually leading this process. What we've done is we've selected 4 areas and we implement the whole participatory approach. Okay, so collecting baseline data from the communities actually participating in it, and working out what their needs actually are, what their resources are. And we've moved away from a needs-based approach. It's looking at it from a strengths-based approach also, and the resources. So communities have done that. In the 4 areas we've done that. They've looked at the kind of programs that they want to be involved in. And plans have been put together for that. And the department is going to currently fund those plans so that they can be put into effect.
You cautioned against macroeconomic theory. Coming from an econ background myself, I was wondering why you feel that those type of large-scale statistical analysis is dangerous, and if you feel they do have some value as far as developing countries are concerned.
I did caution against it because what it does is it misses the human element. So what the social development approach actually does is combines the social objectives with economic development. So it's a combination of both. It balances both. It attempts to, theoretically. And that's what it should be looking at in practice. So there isn't the weight just towards economic development only. So the human aspect and social objectives have to be taken into consideration. What we talk about in terms of development right now in South Africa, the literature is talking about the interaction between macro-level development and micro-level development. And I think that they need to be speaking to each other.
I'm interested in, when you define community, how large or small do you mean when you say from the community or individual level, and who speaks on behalf of these communities with the government? Who's the voice of the community? Are you talking about township level or street level, or?
The work has been mainly with, for those who are not familiar, the Eastern Cape Province has, well, during the apartheid, we had the homelands and the Bantustans. You know what that means. The apartheid government created these countries within a country itself, according to tribes and cultures. And we have 2 of the biggest homelands in the Eastern Cape Province, which is the Transkei and the Ciskei. And these are basically rural communities in non-arable land. So these are the communities that the focus is on, because poverty is actually quite rife in these rural areas. It's the communities through their ward councils. Okay, there are ward structures, which is the basic community level structure. And it is through these councils, and communities actually have community-based organizations. They have set up community project committees, and they've got community-based organizations. So it is working through these organizations and community structures. Any other questions?
I've seen a lot of, it's hard for me to try to balance the idea of helping people change You said that change is important, but it's also important to respect what they're already doing for development. How do you balance those? Does that make sense?
Yeah. We were talking about this. We always talk about change that happens. As a development practitioner, our focus is on bringing about change that is external. Always. We're bringing about change in individuals, in organizations, in families, and in communities. But I think change, and what I want to stress here is that change can only happen within communities if they actually agree to that need for the change to happen. So the first principle here is that you cannot impose that change, okay? And I think if poverty is what community development is attempting to address, then people do want to change. They want to get out of that situation of poverty. So that's not something that is difficult to work through. But I think what is important from a developmental perspective is that there is this need for individual transformation also. The development practitioner himself or herself actually goes through changes through that process, because if we see development as about being about human relationships, then the development practitioner doesn't come out of that relationship without changing also. So change is also an interactive process, but change cannot be imposed. Okay. Because I know there's community development workers who actually say that the community isn't interested. And in South Africa, if you look at the history, dependency is something that was created through the apartheid regime. And getting communities, and one of the things about community development, this is something I didn't mention, is that most of the community development or social service professions actually talk about building self-esteem, building the self-esteem of communities. Apartheid has dehumanized communities in South Africa. And an important objective of community development is actually enhancing not just communities, but individuals in social work, and that's what social work is supposed to be focusing on, is the self-esteem of individuals, of families, and of communities. So apathy is quite a big issue in working with communities, and community development or development practitioners actually find that quite difficult. So it's a long, slow process. This is understanding where the community is coming from and why the community is in such a state.
Can I ask one question? It seems to me that theoretically and philosophically, the term poverty is also problematic as it is with development, because you get in this issue of macro and micro. The problem with poverty in using that kind of terminology is there's no set definition of what poverty is. For example, I think many people, perhaps even the majority of people here, when poverty is used, what comes to mind is economic poverty. And so it's no small wonder that when we talk about development being the
Material poverty.
exactly, and so you get then into GDP and per capita income and those things being focused on. Whereas in defining poverty, if your poverty extends to illiteracy or other types of social injustices or abuse or crime or low self-esteem, then we're getting more closer to the kind of development that you're talking about.
I think then, looking at part of the paper or the program, the postgraduate program actually looks at how we define poverty in South Africa. And one of the questions that I've been asking is that, is community development for the economically poor, economic disadvantaged only? And this is what we are looking at, because there's also, if we are looking at the social development as a framework, then my understanding is that community development should be for everyone in South Africa, because even though we may focus on economic and material poverty right now, because there's a huge need for it, okay, there's a lack of basic essential services, water, sanitation, electricity, those kinds of things have to be attended to. But there's also the need, there's this what I call is spiritual poverty in South Africa. You know, we've gone through such a dehumanizing process for so many decades that we have to look at poverty in a much broader sense, in what you were talking about, and that's quite important also.
They call it poverty alleviation, though, in community development. Is that right? In South Africa, which from the document sounds like they want to address poverty not just on an economic level.
Yes.
Yet when they use the word poverty, then it takes...
This is an anomaly that we've been talking about. So we talk about poverty alleviation, reduction, eradication. So just remember, we're 11 years into democracy, okay? And we've got some exciting things going in South Africa. So we can ask all of the questions that we want to. We can define our concepts the way we see it, relevant to the situation in South Africa. So it's really, really, and I said this yesterday, it's the most exciting time in South Africa. Yeah.
In your work as a practitioner, and I know that it's been fairly recent with all of these theoretical applications, but have you seen some successes as far as implementing these programs and these theories in some communities?
We have this policy, the social development framework. We have a white paper for social welfare. We have a transformation policy. I think South Africa has some of the best policies in the world right now. Okay. Last year and this year, the state president's address to the nation was, it's time for implementation. Okay. So now we're struggling with how do we translate these fantastic policies and how do we implement? But this is what we are talking about, is implementation. 10 years from now, when I come back to BYU, come meet me and I'll answer that question. But there are some success stories. We have some best practices. They're in small pockets. They're not great as yet, but there are some best practices in terms of community development. Do I go back to looking at our education, the paper that I was supposed to present?
I just have a question about the, if you're working with the individual communities, trying to help them to develop themselves and help them develop your community as well, isn't there a problem with getting those communities then to work with other communities? Because the communities are so diverse. There you have the coloreds and then the black communities and the white, two different kinds of white communities, or more than two different kinds of white communities. And I mean, do you find there's a lot of resistance when these communities try to cross these community lines? Because you can develop within a community, but then how do you develop a single national community from those structures?
Okay, that's a process. We're going to look at, community development can be a nation-building process, but it's a slow process. Remember with apartheid, the communities were divided physically into group areas. So right now there's a movement of people, but it's people in the middle and upper income groups that can move. Migration is easier. But there are communities in townships who are still in townships, communities in rural areas who are still in the rural areas, and we need to focus on each one of these communities first. So it's a process. Okay.
We realize that the bell's going to ring here in just a few minutes. For those that maybe need to leave, if you could leave quietly, we'll probably go for another 5 minutes or however long you wish to.
Why don't I do this? I'm going to leave a copy of my paper with Dr. Roby and with you, David. Yes. And if anybody's interested in the whole education process and the models that we have been looking at and suggesting, then you could actually read it. And I'll leave my email address, and if you want to ask me more questions and open a dialogue with me about this, I'd be happy to communicate with you. Is that okay? Okay, thank you.